Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. So I should confess that I put off writing this talk for a long time because I didn't know where to start. And finally, I decided to start where it hurts, the mirror. I used to think I was the only person who looked at her reflection in the mirror and thought, well, what the hell happened? And now I know that seeing the face in the mirror as alien, as other than yourself, is probably the most universal manifestation of internalized ageism. The feeling that our bodies are betraying us simply because they're changing, and that image is not really us. The mirror thing happens to men too, but to grow up female in this youth and beauty obsessed culture is to bring years of judging and being judged to that mirror. Move out from behind the column. All the fun stuff's happening on the other side. As we age, we experience a growing disconnect between how we feel on the inside, youthful, ageless, and the self we imagine the world is seeing in that harsh light, imperfect, overweight, undesirable. I think this discomfort is why my audiences always contain far more women than men, although the reason is obvious here, and it's great to see men here too. We are more vulnerable and braver too, I think, which is good because I'm going to ask you to follow me into uncharted waters. Throughout this talk, I'm going to ask you to do two things, neither of which is easy. Suspend judgment and imagine. That means suspending judgment of me too, please. I am a privileged, straight, white person who didn't even know the word intersectionality until probably, 5 or 10 years ago, because my memory's terrible. Always has been. I don't speak for everyone, especially people of color. I'll miss things, I'll get things wrong, but we don't get anywhere without awkward conversations. And a second admission, which is more painful, even after writing a book about sexism, my previous book was about why women who end their marriages do so well. And even after writing a book on ageism, it is still hard for me to identify as an old woman. Older is easy, old is hard. You might think no one would be happier than me to wear that t-shirt. What a great slogan, old women are your future. But I'm not sure I'm ready for the world to see me that way, to out myself as old. Older, no problem. And for now, I'm coping by hanging on to those two letters at the end. What are some of the other ways we women try to cope? We buy into the promises of anti-aging products. We fudge or lie about our age. We alter our appearance. We get lifted and tucked and plumped. We dye our hair just to cover the gray. Not all these things, not all of us, but none of us are immune. We do these things as a way to reconcile the difference between what we see in the mirror and what we feel like and what we aspire to. We do these things to keep our options open. I know, isn't that hilarious? In an ageist and sexist society, women's access to opportunity depends a lot on what she looks like, the role she can play, the people she can date or marry, the job she can land, the ponds she can swim in. I completely understand why so many of us mask or deny our age. I really do. The stakes are high and the conditioning runs deep. But this culture obsession with the way women look is not about beauty, it's about obedience and power. It underlies what Susan Sontag called the double standard of aging, the social convention that aging enhances men but progressively destroys women. Quote, women reinforce it powerfully with their complacency, with their anguish, with their lies, she wrote. In protecting themselves as women, they betray themselves as adults, unquote. Ouch. We perpetuate this every time we walk in a room and rank the other women in it by age, which we all do. No judgment. Imagine. We can wean ourselves from the thoughts and behaviors that reinforce this double standard of aging. Let's look at what they cost us. Products include Botox and anti-wrinkle, anti-stretch remedies, which are multi-million-dollar industries. Services include anti-pigmentation therapy, anti-adult acne therapy, breast augmentation, liposuction, chemical peel, and hair restoration treatments. Devices include microdermabrasion, laser aesthetics, anti-cellulite treatment, and anti-aging radio frequency devices. Age denial is expensive, and because more older people are women, we represent a market that's going to become ever more significant in the worst way. Quote, no treatments have ever been proven to slow or reverse the aging process, unquote. That's from the National Institute on Aging. Sunscreen is the only product that helps prevent wrinkles. The more we invest in anti-aging products and processes, the harsher the reality when they fail us, as they inevitably do. We fawn over women who age gracefully, and even more over those who seem not to age at all. It's not your fault if you're a minority or have a disability, although there is judgment around that too. But shame on the woman who lets herself go. Refuse to buy in, and you risk being seen not as a brave nonconformist, but as incompetent or lazy. We do this to ourselves and each other. Sometimes I can't even help myself from thinking, couldn't she have made a bit of an effort? What else does age denial do? It leaves stereotypes in place. It is hard not to feel complimented when someone says, you don't look your age. What's the problem? We can only accept the compliment at the expense of other people our age who don't look quite as good as we do, or may not be visible at all. It relies on the ageist assumption that younger equals better. It reinforces the stereotype that people your age look a certain way. And it deprives others of the evidence that age stereotypes are false. What other age could you look besides your own? Seriously. As Gloria Steinem famously responded, "This is what 40 looks like." You don't usually hear the rest of her quote. We've been lying for so long, who would know? When we lie, we're not undoing age stereotypes. We're just saying they don't apply to me. Age denial obscures what is uniquely valuable about getting older. Agelessness. It sounds so seductive, doesn't it? It is what countless magazine covers and beauty products urge us to aspire to. But agelessness consigns us to a kind of limbo. It strips us of something incredibly precious, our years. All the things we've done and been that make us who we are. Age denial makes it impossible to define aging on our own terms, whatever they happen to be, or perhaps claiming the license to speak out, perhaps enjoying feeling less objectified. Age denial makes it harder to learn as we go, to be receptive to the rich possibilities that age can bring: confidence, self-knowledge, perspective, and freedom, especially for women, right? Isn't it better, nicer to feel like, to be less invested in what people think and being judged less? Age denial leaves class out of the picture. When you search stock photo libraries for images of women aging gracefully, this is what you get: white women smiling against pastels. The notion that how successfully we age is up to us, a matter of individual responsibility, assumes a level playing field. Equal access to things like gyms and sushi, and help with caregiving, and decently paying jobs that feed retirement accounts. Women are less likely than their male counterparts to have these advantages. Women of color less likely than white women, and poor women less likely than wealthy ones. Age denial gives discrimination a pass. Passing for younger confers all kinds of short-term social and economic benefits that are really tempting. Angry women have told me, you don't get it. I have children to support, and if I didn't dye my hair, I would lose my job. Dyeing our hair just to cover the gray or leaving early accomplishments off our resumes are really successful strategies, and I completely understand why so many of us engage in them. No judgment, I swear. But they're like a gay person passing for straight, or a person of color passing for white. They're not good for us because they're rooted in shame about something that should not be shameful. And most problematically, they perpetuate the underlying discrimination that makes these behaviors useful, right? Because they just give it a pass. And again, for people who face other kinds of discrimination, like lesbians and women of color, the costs are even higher. Age denial sustains patriarchy. A patriarchy is a society in which men have more power and systematically deny power to women. We saw a pretty horrendous example of it, obviously, during the recent Supreme Court hearings. We live in one. Women participate in patriarchy by accommodating and upholding male power. For example, over half of white American women voters chose an overtly racist president who brags of socially accosting women. Women collaborate by accepting and perpetuating patriarchal norms, being quiet, pretty, accommodating, and so on, whether to get ahead, get by, or simply survive. It's a way to wrest whatever power we can from the system to our best advantage, and it works. But it reinforces a system that exploits and devalues us. No judgment, but we gotta look deeper. All isms, sexism, racism, ableism are not about how we look. They're not about biology. They're about power. Isms operate by pitting us against each other. Men against women, working moms against stay-at-home moms, young against old, in order to maintain the status quo. A recent example, an arbitrarily constructed generational divide in the response to Me Too. Some people suggested using age as a way to understand differences between older and younger feminists. That's a mistake, because it's ageist, because in a Western culture age is not neutral, and because it divides us. In the words of critic Jennifer Wilson, ageism is, quote, a toxic patriarchal tool of control and division employed primarily and most catastrophically against women, unquote. Or as my favorite tweet put it, the problem is not older feminists, the problem is not younger feminists, the problem is goddamn patriarchy, unquote. And a whole bunch of intergenerational division coming up since I wrote this around getting out the vote and tossing, if you want regime change, with a really horrible get out the vote campaign aimed at millennials. I don't know how many of you saw it. The tagline was "The baby boom wants you to stay home." And it was all older white people saying things like, climate change is a you problem, I'll be dead soon. And I just can't remember which isms matter. And that's bigotry, for one thing. But it's also, if we're gonna change the world in the ways I think most of us in the room wanna see, we need old and young working together. We cannot afford to buy that. So when you see this old versus young logic, please question it. Prejudices intersect and reinforce each other. We see that in the way the harshest form of ageism is aimed at women, and the most ruthless form of misogyny reserved for the old, to silence and subdue us and keep us in our place. Why is simply calling someone an old woman an insult? What does it say about our culture? Why is there granny bashing and no grandpa bashing? This patriarchy ushers women on stage in our early teens and ushers us off it in midlife, if not before. Many women speak of going from catcalled and harassed to being ignored and invisible, from babe to ballbuster to pearl clutcher. We are so steeped in patriarchy, we have so deeply internalized its values that we don't realize the harm that it does. Why are older women such easy targets? Why have we laughed along? Why have we allowed this? Because sexism alone, if we see how ugly the underlying misogyny is, how we collude in it, and how deep it runs, is a terrifying subject. Misogyny is dislike, contempt, or ingrained prejudice against women. Pair it with ageism, which we are just beginning to confront, and the full truth is immensely painful, right? We need to sit with that, even though it's really hard. Entire industries are built on promoting fear and loathing around women's aging, encouraging all of you to perceive my 66-year-old face and body as hideous. None of this is natural, and none of it is fixed. Not that long ago, it was considered unnatural for white middle-class women to work outside the home, for black and white people to be friends, for gay people to make lives together, for people with disabilities to be out in the world. Till a really short time ago. Change is slow, but it is real. It begins internally by looking at how the double whammy of ageism and sexism affects how we see ourselves. No judgment. And the next step is to look at how those social forces play out in the world around us. Sexism and ageism are built into the way organizations, institutions, and social networks function, which is why it's so fantastic that you've been working for a day and a half on thinking about exactly that. This creates structural inequality, and it is the reason that men and women experience aging differently. The ways in which age and gender intersect affect every corner of our lives everywhere on the planet. Worldwide, women are less likely to be educated, which reduces our access to jobs and to healthcare, and our ability to shape our own lives. Widows and unmarried older women are particularly vulnerable and subject to abuse, especially in the majority world. The effects on our income, health, and well-being add up over time, and they're further compounded by race and by class, which is why everywhere in the world, the sickest of the sick and poorest of the poor are old women of color. Here's a closer look at 3 domains: economics, caregiving, and health, where the stakes are particularly high. Women live longer and earn less. Our society values so-called women's work less, especially if it is associated with women of color, who make up 2/3 of all minimum age workers today. American women earn about 80 cents on the dollar compared with men, an improvement of about half a penny per dollar earned every year since the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963. For women of color, the pay gap is much greater. African American women are paid 64% of what white men earn, compared with 54% for Hispanic and Latina women. 54%. And this stuff kicks in early. Two important overarching ideas are that ageism also affects younger people. It's any judgment about a person or group of people on the basis of age. And also, just like aging isn't something inconvenient that older people do, you know, your parents or baby boomers or celebrities, we're aging lifelong, and that this stuff kicks in early. It casts a shadow lifelong. The wage gap widens between ages 32 and 40 when women start getting passed over promotions, because they might be just thinking about having kids, and we know your brain can't work at the same time as your uterus is working. That's Pat Schroeder's line, and it's a good one. When she ran for Congress, and you know, they're like, wow, could you do this? You're a mom. Like, what's up with that? Sorry, digression. And the damage is cumulative. We make less not because we have kids or lack confidence or choose lower paying fields, but because of systematic discrimination in the workplace. One of the biggest problems facing older women is hiring discrimination. Visible signs of aging are held against us, although employers don't have to see us to reject us. In 2015, the National Bureau of Economic Research submitted more than 40,000 mock online job applications. Older women had the fewest callbacks. The wage gap disastrously affects women's financial security in old age. Lower incomes obviously make it harder to save. Wage history determines Social Security and pension benefits, so women receive less in retirement because the time you spend raising kids or helping your parents or in-laws counts, is taken away from your Social Security benefits. And we live longer and spend more on medical expenses, so savings have to go further. Consequently, in 2014, women over age 65 were more than twice as likely as men to live in poverty. Poverty rates are particularly high at about 1 in 4 among Black, Native American, and Hispanic women, and for foreign-born women and those with disabilities. When women are poor, so are our children. More than half of all poor children live in families headed by women, who are more likely to be custodial parents, which brings us to caregiving. Caregiving is a tender, beautiful, enriching part of being human. Women do 2/3 of it, perhaps looking after both kids and parents, and later on parents, grown children, and their children, what I call the club sandwich generation. Because thanks to the longevity revolution, 4 and even 5 living generations are becoming commonplace, which is incredible. I mean, it's an amazing achievement. This wouldn't be a problem if this important work were valued, decently paid, and optional. It is none of those things. There's plenty of lip service about the selfless people who do this important work, but little protection from its economic, personal, and professional consequences. What turns caregiving into a burden? Going it alone, without supports. When demands become overwhelming, it's really hard for people, whether they're parents or children or lovers or just dear friends, to do what only we can do, preserve relationships that sustain and define us, and make people prefer the care of the people we love. Professional caregivers, most of whom are women and many of whom are undocumented immigrants, earn a meager annual income wage of $13,000. Most of us do it part-time for free. Hispanics and African Americans spend more time caregiving and have greater responsibilities than their white or Asian American peers. It's harder to get back in the labor force if you dropped out to care for someone. There's statistics about how U.S. women are dropping out of the labor market at higher rates, not because they want to, but because they can't afford to pay for caregiving. And I should say, also, there's some cards on the table. My website is thischairrocks.com/blog. I've been writing out loud, thinking out loud about this on the blog for a really long time. It's searchable by topic. So if you want to find statistics, it's there, or email me. And I have a really good book that's coming out, being reissued by Macmillan in the fall. So all this stuff is available. I mean, all the data behind this. Let's see, where was I? And it's much harder to find a job with the flexible schedule that, of course, caregivers need, which makes it more likely for caregivers to end up working part-time jobs, often for lower wages, without benefits like pensions, sick leaves, and health care, and many draw on their own savings and income while they're looking after others, further jeopardizing their own retirement security. The current system takes for granted that family members can and will take on caregiving, as millions of us do, as tenderly and willingly. The burden is likely to grow as care becomes more privatized and the aging in place movement grows, which has great things about it, but real drawbacks. More women step up to these duties, staying home with a sick kid or driving an in-law to doctor's appointments, because the one who keeps working full-time is the one who earns most, which is usually the man because of the wage gap. Thank you, Stella. The sexism is obvious. The system privileges men over women at every turn. The ageism is clear. The very old and very young need the most care, and an ageist culture values them less. They converge to make women more vulnerable over time. Women live longer and sicker. Biology is partly responsible, as are the inequalities across the lifespan that I've already talked about. More women than men are disabled. Living past menopause increases the risk of hormone-related conditions like osteoporosis. The only reason I was turned down for long-term care 2 years ago. It's the only thing wrong with me so far. Ageism in healthcare is rampant. Doctors often dismiss treatable conditions. At your age, what do you expect? If your doctor ever says that, find a new doctor. Internalized ageism, right, our own ideas, expectations of decline, and learned helplessness play a role too. Women are socialized to be passive and compliant, and the dominant subordinate relationship that we have between patient and doctor, typically, it's getting better, doesn't help. Much ageism and sexism is benevolent, justified on the basis that women, especially old women, don't know what's best for us, which of course requires disempowering us. It's one reason older women receive fewer medical examinations, less follow-up, and less preventive care than older men, and less aggressive treatment for conditions like joint and cardiac disease. We suffer longer because we're diagnosed later, and we're more likely to be considered too weak or too frail to withstand surgery, although there is no evidence that it is any less effective in women. Experiencing discrimination itself is an important risk factor for poor mental and physical health. Older women of color and poor women receive the worst care in hospitals. Less treatment, fewer interventions, less respect for end-of-life decisions. Older lesbians frequently encounter homophobia, heterosexism, and ageism in the healthcare system. Achieving equal rights for women from birth to death means looking at how all these isms, all these prejudices intersect and shape each of our lives. All these disparities in wages, in who cares for your kids or your mom, in what you eat and where you live, are compounded by belonging to more than one stigmatized group. Even if women achieve gender equality this minute, for example, women of color would still be oppressed by racism, and white men would still have more privilege. And I'll digress here to say that it's really, really important that the movement against ageism not repeat the mistakes of the women's movement, which was to ignore the additional issues faced by women of color. That schism has tarnished the women's movement to this day, and it's really important that we reach across to bridge ageism and ableism, which no one is doing. People with disabilities are ageist like everyone else, and a lot of people in the aging field understandably want to reject the assumption, which is not the same, that aging and illness are the same, which they are not, just as disability and illness are not the same. But there is overlap. It's time to acknowledge it, and it's time to learn from the kick-ass work that disability rights activists did in the 70s. When prejudice goes unchallenged, as ageism has until very recently, it seems normal, just the way things are. Until feminism taught women new scripts, we blamed ourselves for our second-class status, just as we blame ourselves now for not aging well or successfully or letting ourselves go. And I love aging successfully, as if you could fail at getting older, right? Well, why should old age be? We don't fail at childhood. Like, what's up with that? Change starts between our ears. No judgment. Imagine. The critical point is to acknowledge our own prejudices, to look for ways in which we are ageist instead of for evidence that we're not, because you can't challenge bias unless you're aware of it. And everyone is biased some of the time. The conditioning is so deep and so profound that it's hard to envision a different way of being in the world. But again, none of this prejudice is natural, and none of it is fixed. Those feelings that crop up when we look in the mirror, that what we see is lesser or uglier or other than what we feel, They crop up not just because we weren't always old, but because we learned to be ageist in early childhood, when attitudes towards race and gender start to form. Look at the early Disney cartoons, or a lot of children's books or cartoons. Some of these feelings come from consumer culture, which bombards us with ways to fix or stop or cure aging. Some of these feelings come from somewhere deeper and uglier, the culture's entrenched misogyny. And just as older people can be ageist, women can be misogynist. Another painful fact. This is a lot to overcome. It can feel like trying to lift a boulder, but we don't have to lift it alone. We have heroes and visionaries and each other and consciousness raising. This powerful tool catalyzed the women's movement. Women came together and compared personal experiences and used them to unpack unconscious prejudices, right? They didn't realize that they were there. Women learned that what they thought were personal problems, like not being heard or being harassed or respected and not respected, were actually widely shared political problems that required collective action. It took a social movement to wake people up to the fact that the obstacles women faced weren't all in our head, but the result of entrenched systems at work, sexism and patriarchy, compounded for many more by racism, ableism, or homophobia. Consciousness raising is the first step in a process of social change that involves conversation, collaboration, activism, art, advocacy, and eventually legislation. Only a few will take it that far. Think how intolerable a world full of activists would be, after all. If you want to start a consciousness raising group, you can download a guide, Who Me Ageist, from my website, and Stella and I are collaborating on a version just for women. And another thing I want to do around that is to bring older and younger women together and to talk about aging, perhaps using that guide, and call it You Will Look Like Us, right? Because, I mean, let's look at the looking thing right in the eye and think, you know, you will look like us, and that's pretty fantastic, actually. So you can download the Who Me Ageist guide on my website, /resources. It's right up there up front. It's a free PDF. If all you do is push back a bit when someone says you look great for your age, that is completely valid. No judgment. We all have to do it in our own way, at our own speed. Try responding, you look great for your age too. No judgment. Imagine. If we want equal rights, and for those rights not to diminish over time, we need to understand the personal and social forces at work behind our second-class status, take that awareness out into the world, and change the culture. It is time to mobilize against ageism the way we did against sexism. Seem like too big an ask? Look at how the position of women in Western society has changed in my lifetime alone. When Hillary Clinton started at Yale Law School in 1969, she was told that she was taking a man's rightful place. It was legal for a man to rape his wife, abortion was mostly outlawed, and women were barely visible in politics and business. We still have a long way to go, and it sure feels that way lately. But just as different prejudices reinforce each other, so do different forms of activism. When we chip away at ageism, we make sexism less sustainable, and vice versa. And places that are better for old women are better for everyone, right? Better for people of color, better for people with, I mean, all this stuff is intuitively obvious. It's why I'd like to swap out, I don't know if you've heard the term age-friendly cities. New York is one, Portland. I want them to become all age-friendly cities, because the thing that make community, you know, public transportation, parks, social services, better for families, better for employees. They're better for everyone. That's a way to avoid that old versus young framing, just one way. The women's movement taught us to claim our power, and a movement against ageism will teach us how to hold onto it. How can we get old and stay powerful? We get old and stay powerful by tapping into what we know. Getting older enriches us. Growing older isn't just different from what we've been brainwashed to believe. It's way better. We know this. That flicker of cognitive dissonance is what brings, I think, so many people to my work. Late life may be the best time of all, especially for women. Aging brings authenticity, confidence, perspective, self-awareness. It's easier to manage emotions. My mother said her legs got better. We want less. There are real losses. I'm not a Pollyanna about this. From physical capacities to beloved friends, but it never dawns on most of us that the experience of reaching old age, or middle age, or even just aging past youth can be better or worse depending on the culture in which it takes place. Who in this room really believes that she is inferior to the woman she once was? Less interesting, less intelligent, less competent, less fun in bed? Unless we challenge the underlying message that to age is to lose value as a human being, right? It's that basic and that ugly. It becomes part of our identity. That's internalized ageism. And the more clearly we see these social forces at work, the easier it is to envision alternative, more positive, and more accurate narratives. I mean, this is not happy talk. This is backed by science and by data and by our own lived experience. Let's make sure the whole story gets told and do our best to embody it. We get old and stay powerful by liberating our view of attractiveness. Where does the idea that older women's bodies are unattractive come from? Quote, "It should be perfectly familiar," wrote pioneering feminist Cynthia Rich. "It's like the distaste anti-Semites feel toward Jews, homophobes towards lesbians and gays, racists towards blacks, the drawing back of the oppressor from the physical being of the oppressed." Right? That's a political construct. That's not biology. All marginalized people have heard that it's natural for others to be physically repelled by them. That's why the slogan, "Black is beautiful," was coined by the civil rights movement to challenge the aesthetic that darker skin and African features were unattractive and to counter the practice of people with lighter skin attempting to pass as white. The practice of attempting to pass as younger is equally self-destructive. And overturning the notion that old equals ugly is no more far-fetched. Instead of muttering what the hell happened at the face in the mirror, how about taking a moment to recall some of the things that did happen and how remarkable a lot of them were. My hands now recall, that's an Israeli artist, she made wrinkle jewelry. My hands now remind me of my mother's on the steering wheel of her Bel Air station wagon, carting her 4 kids around Washington, D.C. What's wrong with my knobby white knuckles? Absolutely nothing. We are being sold a bill of goods and paying the price, both literally and in diminished confidence in our bodies as a never-ending source of pleasure. I'm not suggesting for a minute that we abandon vanity, the urge to adorn ourselves, to feel beautiful, to look our best. I'm suggesting that we stop being each other's cruelest critics. I don't know about you, but when I hear about a woman starting to let her hair go gray, it's her woman friends. The husband is usually like, "You look great, hon." And it's her women friends who say, "Hey, you know, are you sure you want to do that?" You know, we're so hard on each other. I'm suggesting we aspire to looking great instead of looking young. If we believe it, we make it so. What's my evidence? Scan your acquaintance for those who are sexually active, if that's a priority, and it's fine if it's not. It's not the prettiest or the thinnest or the youngest. It's the ones who know their lovers are lucky. No judgment. Imagine. Listen to ad man Chuck Nyron on older women's bodies, which offer, quote, "contours aplenty, shapes galore, curves, mounds, crannies. Afterwards, you think about what you didn't get to play with yet," unquote. Why does that seem so damn radical? Why didn't we think of that? Why not, above all, learn to look more generously at each other and ourselves? Writer and activist Lindy West has described staring at parts of bodies she had always reviled on herself, like fat rolls and arm fat, consciously deciding to find them beautiful and learning that it worked. Want to change the way you see people, whether they're fat or trans or old, or the way you see yourself? Work at it. Desire is not innate, and it is not immutable. Seeing differently is a radical ask indeed, a collective act of imagining, and the work of a lifetime. It is both necessary and possible. This is not to deny the exquisite attraction of youth, but it's not zero-sum. A more expansive, inclusive vision doesn't mean less for younger women. It's more for us all, because otherwise we compete against each other and perpetuate bias and envy and oppression and exclusion. We get old and stay powerful by coming together in groups of all ages. Having friends across the generations is crucial in 1,000 ways. We learn from each other's stories about being told we talk too much or wear too much makeup or not enough, or are crazy or angry. What young woman hasn't been shut down by an older one who felt threatened or was just being mean? We need female solidarity from birth to death, from diapers to menstruation to menopause, and back to diapers again if that's how it turns out, and to be able to cast a wide net lifelong. Sometimes being with younger friends makes me feel younger, and sometimes it makes me feel ancient. It's complicated for them too. I know they're thinking, "I hope I age as well as Ashton," and I hope that never happens to me. I know because it's what I used to think. This alienation from older women and apprehension at becoming like us is not natural. It is not inevitable. It is not a function of being female. It is the result of social forces, ageism, sexism, capitalism, patriarchy in this case, that make us fearful and keep us from joining forces. The only person in my office, I worked at the Museum of Natural History until a year and a half ago when I turned 65, got on Medicare, and could do this full time. And she drank my Kool-Aid, and she's glad she did, but a little while before I quit, she said she had nearly bitten the head off of a woman who was complaining about how hard it was to turn 30. And I gently pointed out that the forces that are flipping that 29-year-old out were the same ones that make her own upcoming 70th so fraught, right? It's the same stuff. As is, younger women retain power by distancing themselves from older ones. Do you know Deborah Rappaport? She's a New Yorker. She has a fantastic style blog. But think of that, retaining power, younger women, by distancing themselves from us. You know, that's painful. And older women try to hold on to power by denying that we're aging and trying desperately to stay young. You don't need a PhD in women's studies to figure out that these behaviors are not good for us. They set us up to fail. They prioritize appearance. They yoke power to conventional sex appeal, looking young, which gives women a very short and shaky window of opportunity, and they give discrimination a pass. No judgment. Imagine. Do we want to maintain power relations that privilege the male, the white, and the wealthy by continuing to compete? Or do we want to subvert them? Do we want to keep colluding in our own disempowerment to dig the hole deeper? Or do we want to throw away the damn shovel? As is, each generation has to figure out on its own how futile and punishing it is to fear aging and to wear ourselves out on the hamster wheel of age denial, and how much of our youth we waste spending on worrying about it, right? We waste on worrying about getting older needlessly, right? It is time to unite and break the chain. This means bringing women together, reaching across age and race and class and ability in the process to work on new ways of thinking and behaving. Because the sisterhood forged by the women's movement left women of color out and older women behind. Because the only way to dismantle both ageism and sexism is to pair crone power with girl power. Look at the global feminist awakening that Me Too has catalyzed. The patriarchy is fighting back, and I wrote that pre-Kavanaugh. No one gives up power without a struggle, and women of all ages need to join forces against this backlash. Because we have a historic opportunity to forge a movement against ageism that brings us together and leaves no one out. Aging is, after all, the one universal human experience, right? So we ought to be able to come together around that and then tackle whatever smaller cause we want, or more specific, not smaller cause. Aging is inevitable. Ageism, the loss of voice and agency, is not. And that's the part that makes aging while female so much harder than it has to be. A system designed to exploit our insecurities can only do so if we agree to it. We can change the way we look at ourselves and see each other and value what we see. We can insist on being seen and respected as our full, rich, messy, lumpy, complicated selves. We can move slowly, if we have the will and the desire and the vision, imagine, from competing to collaborating. We can turn it from a conversation about scarcity and loss to one about empowerment and equity, and we can take that conversation out into the world. Grappling with our internalized prejudices, being kinder and more generous to each other and ourselves, making friends of all ages, these are important tasks in their own right. They change us and the way we are in the world. Their value increases exponentially if we see confronting ageism as part of a broader cultural revolution and join the movement to dismantle it. Let's embody what we know, that aging is an accomplishment and an enriching one, defiantly when necessary. Let's reject the depiction of aging as a problem to be fixed or an affliction to be cured, and claim it for what it is, a natural, powerful, lifelong process that unites us all. Let's swap age shame for age pride. Age pride is for anyone who refuses to regret waking up a day older, who acknowledges long life as the privilege that it is, and who is prepared to challenge the power structures that underlie all discrimination. What change would each of us like to see? Who will we reach out to across the generations to make it happen? Game on. Thank you.